My friend and neighbor, Dr. Herb Asher, is currently Professor Emeritus of Political Science at The Ohio State University. He previously served as counselor to the university president, senior vice president for government affairs, and founding director of the John Glenn Institute, which is now called the Glenn College. He's worked for 6 university presidential administrations as an advisor or as a leader of university government relations. He joined the OSU faculty in 1970 and taught courses on campaigns and elections, polling and public opinion, Ohio politics, and political methodology. Herb Asher earned his undergrad degree at Bucknell University, majoring in mathematics. Not sure what that has to do with politics. And got 2 advanced degrees, his MA and PhD at the University of Michigan.
That's enough. That's enough.
Okay, Herb. Please welcome Professor Herb Asher.
It's good to be with you. It's always good to be with a more mature audience, meaning if you're used to teaching students between 18 and 22, you realize there are a lot of things you cannot assume about their knowledge of history, their appreciation of what's happened in the last couple of decades, and certainly their appreciation for what happened before they were born. So it's good to know that I'm looking here, I can see that there's some people on this meeting who actually were alive when there was a president who actually had on his desk, "The buck stops here." And now that's not a partisan comment, but you all would appreciate it a lot more than people who are 20. And most of us, of course, were around in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the post-World War II era, where one of the most significant events was the West, led by the United States, winning the Cold War. When I would say the Cold War to some of our students today, they think it was a battle between Bud Light and Miller or something. And I say, no, it was the major event of the post-World War II era. And it was really a bipartisan effort on the part of the United States, with presidents like Truman and Reagan and others who led us to the point where, in fact, the Iron Curtain fell and many of the Russian satellites became free nations. And NATO, of course, was formed in that era. And of course, I mention it only because our current administration, and this will be an issue in the campaign, and it was brought up at the Democratic convention, it doesn't seem that the current president really appreciates NATO as much as his opponents think he should. And of course, Vladimir Putin doesn't accept the results of the Cold War. And so that's that'll be a lesser issue in this campaign, but nevertheless, I think it's relevant. And it's nice to be talking to a group that actually knows what the Cold War is and knows that Harry Truman actually did believe that the buck stops here, which is a very refreshing notion. Let me make a few predictions. I think Biden will win the campaign, but we always are very careful about hedging our bets, but Trump still could win. And so, in fact, same prediction I made in 2016, Hillary I thought would win, but Trump could still win. And let me help you here, because you're going to see a lot of polling and then a lot of work done by Nate Silver and Nate Cohn, where they start simulating the outcome of the election. They do this massive computer simulation. They throw in all sorts of polling data. They have information from each of the 50 states, and they run thousands of simulations. And then they look for each simulation who won. And back in 2016, most of those simulations showed that 70% of the time that you ran a hypothetical election, Hillary won 70% of the time. And I'd have to remind audiences, that's not saying she has 70% in the polls. What that is saying is that if you ran the election 1,000 times, 10,000 times, she'd win 70% of the time. And then I would remind people that events that have a 30% probability of occurring actually do occur. And that's exactly what happened in 2016. So I would predict today that Biden will win, but Trump surely can win this election. I also would predict that the US Senate will remain under Republican control unless there is a really big Biden victory. And that victory would have to be in the range of a mini landslide, 8 to 10 points or whatever. I think that the U.S. House will remain under Democratic control, plus or minus a few seats for either party. If Donald Trump is reelected, he will likely lose the popular vote once again, and probably by a larger margin than he lost it in 2016. Here in Ohio, I predict that Trump will carry Ohio, but Biden could still carry it, depending upon really what happens to the overall Republican effort. But the good news for our local TV stations is that we have sort of become a battleground again. So that means we're going to have the television commercials, and our local TV stations will be making more money than they thought a year ago in terms of putting all these ads on. The two key races in Ohio, and this really surprised the heck out of people in 2016, are the two races for the Ohio Supreme Court. I'm sorry, those are the two key races this year. 2 years ago, when the Republicans swept every statewide administrative office in Ohio, they lost 2 Ohio Supreme Court seats. So going into 2018, the court was dominated 7-0 by Republicans. They lost 2 seats in 2018. So now it's 5-2. There are 2 seats on the ballot this year, 2 Republican incumbents against 2 fairly well-known Democratic challengers. And that's going to be the big battle in Ohio. If the Democrats were to win both those seats, they would then take control of the Ohio Supreme Court by a 4-3 margin. Do not expect much change in the Ohio Senate or the Ohio House. I sort of laugh when I say that because despite the recent changes in leadership in the Ohio House, they have the tremendous advantage of incumbency, gerrymander districts, and money. And in the Ohio Senate, the Democrats are such a small minority that they might just as well be a candidate for, a charitable contributions or whatever. One thing I want to talk about is that mail voting, mailed-in ballots works. And I'm really upset with what the president's been saying and doing. But we've had a very good system in Ohio, led by Republican secretaries of state and the Democratic secretary of state. And it's really outrageous what the president, and he's been linking mail voting to fraud, your vote's not going to count, da-da-da-da-da. And I think there's really, the president in some ways is not a very well-informed person, but in another way, he's a very smart person. And I think what he's really been doing here is trying to get people to say, oh my goodness, my ballot won't be counted, or if something's wrong, something's going to happen. Maybe I better vote in person. So if people do not vote by mail, then in fact, at some point, they're going to have to go to the polls. And who knows, by November 3rd, the weather could be lousy, the pandemic could be worse, and you might have a lot of people who will say, well, I really don't want to do that. I think, what I would simply recommend, no matter who you're supporting, if you want to vote absentee, Ohio gave us the benefit of no-fault absentee. Request your absentee ballot early, fill it out, get it in early, don't wait till the last minute. But this notion that, millions and millions of votes, how's the post office going to handle this? Well, if you accept that argument, you might as well not send out Christmas cards, because the volume of mail at Christmas time is so much greater than that. So vote early, not often, just vote early, just vote once, and you can check. You can check whether your ballot has been received. It's not as if it's blindly going into some magical area where you don't know what happens to it. You can also, if you want to, vote absentee, and you can drop your ballot off at the polling place, especially the one on Morse Road. So I would certainly endorse mail voting, particularly for people who are worried about going out to the polls and worried about the pandemic. The central point of the Democratic convention, if you watched it, is that Donald Trump is unfit to be president. I mean, they criticized him on issues, but really what they were mainly saying is that the man doesn't have the character, doesn't have the ethics, doesn't have the morality to, in fact, be the president of the United States. And they make that argument so that just in case the economy has come back really very well by Election Day, and if something miraculous happens with the virus and the pandemic, they would still say that doesn't change the fact that Donald Trump has been, from the point of view of character, not a very good president. I expect that one of the strongest points coming out of the Republican convention this week will be the argument that Democrats are soft on law and order, that Democrats are anti-police, that Democrats hate America, that they are too close to un-American groups like Muslims and Mexicans, protesters and criminals. And so it'll be a very, very tough convention. It's also possible that maybe they'll pivot and try to, in a sense, present Donald Trump as the president, the great unifier, which of course he has not been to this point or whatever. The next set of events coming up are going to be the debates. And the Democrats sort of did a good job in the past couple of weeks of lowering expectations about Joe Biden's speech. And I know a lot of Democrats who, when Biden was finished, they were overjoyed. They didn't know what they were going to see, but geez, so many of the conversations had been, oh my goodness, Joe's not a great speaker. The president, of course, has been referring to Joe as slow, not quite dim-witted, but also suggesting he's senile. And so the expectations were so low, and Biden did knock it out of the park. It was a great speech, and it served the purposes for Biden. But now we're going to get to the next round, and that'll be the debates. And I think we'll see here Biden trying to be presidential, Trump trying to upset him, get under his skin. But we also know that the president can easily get upset. So, watch out for that. Another thing to watch out for is an October surprise. But, and typically in the past, we thought of an October surprise as being some sort of foreign policy kind of initiative, like when the Democrats really announced plans for peace in Vietnam toward the end of the presidential campaign, I think in '68. But who knows what the October surprise would be? And the last couple of days, we've had a lot of surprises. We had various books coming out. I mean, the profession to be in these days is to write a book, and a book that will have some validated accusations, but also a book that might have, well, I heard, somebody told me, I'm not saying this, but I did hear this, and da 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 da. And but we'll have, the taping of the president's sister. That I find that to be offensive in a way, but the content of what she's saying, actually for a lot of people is not new, but still to have his sister say that. I just heard, and I don't know, maybe you can confirm this. So Kellyanne Conway is leaving the campaign after the convention's over. That's a loss for the president because she's really one of the saner heads among the White House staff. She's really a very savvy person. And I heard that her husband is leaving the Lincoln Project. And of course, if you've seen any of the ads from the Lincoln Project, this is a group of Republicans that are taking out ads being very critical of Donald Trump. And certainly one of the themes of the Democratic convention, uttered by certainly our former governor, John Kasich, is that it's okay for Republicans to vote for Joe Biden. Don't vote for all those other Democrats, but Joe Biden's a good guy. And so we're going to see a lot of efforts still for Democrats trying to get Republicans to, in fact, endorse Biden. But will the president have any major announcements? He announced yesterday about plasma therapy. That may be very significant. But I'm really trying to think of other things that could happen in the last couple of weeks, in the last month of the campaign, that could be a game changer. And I always think in terms of foreign policy, but I'm not thinking of what that could be at this stage. But maybe you all could help me think about what could really capture people's attention, because certainly it's the area of foreign policy that the president would have the greatest leverage, if you will, to shape events or whatever. So we'll see about that. And I think it will be a dispiriting campaign. I think it'll be a campaign that I think the president is very savvy. He wants a low turnout election, knowing that his base, which is still very strongly supportive of him, will come out and vote no matter what. But the Democrats are relying upon votes from young people who are disproportionately pro-Democratic and pro-Biden. And we all know that in the past, young people have not turned out at a very high rate. And the Democrats are certainly hoping for a high black turnout. And they're hoping, of course, that not only will black females vote, because in past elections they have, but black males will vote. And that's been a very low turnout rate. And Democrats are certainly hoping that Latinos will turn out. Latinos will not vote as heavily Democratic as blacks will. Blacks will probably vote somewhere 85 to 90% Republican. Latinos will vote something like 60 to 70%. Blacks will vote heavily Democratic. Latinos will vote, 60 to 70% Democratic. Latinos are a much more diverse group when you start talking about Cubans versus Central Americans versus Mexicans. It's not a monolithic group, but a heavily Democratic group. So the higher the turnout, the greater the advantage that Biden gets from those groups. And the efforts on the mail voting, it was interesting. Just as the president was trashing mail voting, he said mail voting is fine. And in Florida, where he cast his absentee ballot, he said, well, we've got a good governor here in Florida, Republican governor. And one of the things that happened in Florida is you can actually see by the requests who is requesting an absentee ballot. And the initial requests in Florida were 3-1 Democratic. And then the Trump campaign decided, we better start doing some television advertising, encouraging Republicans to request their mail ballots. So let me stop at that point. You can obviously tell which candidate I prefer, but let's go to some questions that people might have or observations.
Herb, normally a president would get a lot of traction for brokering a Middle East deal. And in this case, there's almost no traction from it, even though it's probably driven by the Obama administration's deal with Iran. It forced the Sunnis together with Israel. But nonetheless, he doesn't seem to be getting any credit for that. What's the...
That's a really good question. And this has happened in other areas, not quite as perhaps significant as that. How often does Trump step on his own message when, in fact, here is a major development? Why don't you just focus on that at least for a day and make that a repeated thing and have other Republicans in the chorus with you saying, what a great advancement. And instead he starts tweeting again and he starts attacking other people. So often he steps on his message. He sort of stepped on the message a little with respect to this plasma therapy, although I don't think that would have been as significant. The FDA sped up, the approval of it and all of that. But I agree that that's actually a significant development. We don't know what it's going to lead to from that point on, but it actually, remember, the Israelis were going to, in fact, just basically claim the West Bank. They were going to change the borders of Israel. And so at least temporarily, they have said they won't do that. It hasn't been ruled out, but it bought a little bit more time for negotiation. So, he did not get a lot of credit for that. And I think part of that is that, part of that's also our media. There's too much going on out there. And look, this is all about politics. It's all about personalities. And again, one of my criticisms of the media, and I'll say this about, many of the stations and many of the cable stations, if your reporters are not informed about certain issues or policies, or don't know a lot, for example, about the Middle East or whatever, then in fact, an agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates might not fit into their knowledge frame or whatever. So I think there are a lot of reasons. But again, Trump steps on his messages way too often. Yeah. Yes.
You had mentioned, if I understood and heard this right, that you're saying that 80% of the African-American votes would go for Trump.
I misstated. No, to go for obviously for Biden.
Okay.
And it might be. Yeah, I know. I realized I said that. Yeah. Don't believe me. The election's over. Democrats have lost. No. And in fact, it might be 90%. And the Latino vote, it traditionally has had the lowest turnout. And so one wonders, will the past 4 years lead Latinos? And let me put aside Cubans, but who actually do vote at a decent rate. Will they now be so energized, in part because of Trump's comments about immigrants, Mexicans, Central Americans, the treatment of Puerto Rico during the hurricane that we had? Will they turn out at a high rate? And if they turn out at a high rate, that makes Florida even more competitive with respect to the Puerto Rican vote in Florida. Democrats have to make a decision about what their battleground states truly are. Remember, in 2016, Hillary never went to Wisconsin. How dumb. Donald Trump told us in 2016 how he was going to win. He was going to do well in the Rust Belt. He was going to do well in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. And he did. And Democrats in 2016 started thinking, well, maybe we can play in Texas or North Carolina or Georgia or Arizona. Well, if you have a lot of money, you can play, meaning you can do media and all of that in many states. But if your resources are finite, you've got to prioritize. And I would certainly recommend here, obviously, that Democrats have to regain Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin and hold on to Minnesota. And if they can win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Ohio will be more competitive than it was in 2016. Trump's victory in 2016 was an impressive 8%. Everybody complained about how wrong the national polls were in 2016. They weren't that wrong. The national polls showed Hillary winning the popular vote. She did win the popular vote. But two polls that came out the Sunday before the election in Ohio were absolutely wrong. There was one poll that had Trump winning Ohio by 1, and another poll that Hillary winning the Ohio by 1. And they were both very, very wrong. Trump won by 8%. And so I think it's always more difficult for the Democrats to carry Ohio than just by the nature of the population composition, the strength of the Democratic Party, some other reasons. More difficult for the Democrats to carry Ohio than it is to carry Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So certainly their top priority should be those 3 states. But then you have to ask, what about Ohio? What about Florida? And North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona and Texas? And if the Democrats can win a few of those, they could actually have a substantial electoral college majority. That's what the campaign is going to be looking at. But, when they canceled their convention, well, I'm sorry, they didn't quite cancel it. I thought, their convention was supposed to be in Milwaukee. And I thought, I'm sure the Wisconsin residents understand why they didn't have a normal convention. But I think it would be a mistake for Biden and Harris not to make a quick trip to Wisconsin to say, wish we could have been here for the convention, and spend some time in Wisconsin. Now the issue becomes, and this is another question, how are you going to campaign in this election? Presumably you shouldn't be having large rallies. You certainly should not be having large indoor rallies. How will you get the message out? Are the candidates going to be, on the stump, so to speak? And I think they need to be within limits, to actually just send a signal to Wisconsin and to Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio. We really care, and we're trying to be there.
Hey, Herb, we have a question from John Stewart and then John Mariotti.
Okay.
All right, Herb, does anybody care about the national debt anymore?
No. That is such a good question, because when I hear
neither side.
Well, yeah, I know, but remember, traditionally, it's been the Democrats are what? The tax and spend party. And Republicans are the, cut taxes and cut spending. And of course, nobody's there. And the arguments right now are, should we add another $1 trillion or $3 trillion to the national debt? And I've asked a number of people the question, when should we really start worrying about this? Interest rates are so low right now that you can sort of finance the debt and print more money. But what happens, when that situation changes? And in the 1990s, this was probably the last time that the federal government was actually somewhat serious about the debt. There were a number, and Ross Perot played a major role in doing that. But actually, Democrats and Republicans got nervous about the interest on the national debt increasing perhaps exponentially. So it actually would drive out spending for defense and social welfare and all of that. And they actually made some decisions in the 1990s, Clinton, Gingrich, others, that were actually reining in the growth in the national debt. And of course, what's amazing here, when you tell people, well, now look, there's an annual deficit, but when we have a deficit of $1 trillion or $2 trillion or $5 trillion, that's already adding to an existing national debt. But, and I can be sympathetic that saying in a pandemic, that's not the time to shut things down. But, you know, when does this come home to roost? So I'm that is a concern. It's a concern, but nobody will talk about it because they're both guilty. Yeah. There was another question?
Yeah,
Yep.
I have a question. The magnitude of an October surprise. Let's do a sizing exercise. In your opinion, would a vaccine release in mid or late October be a big enough October surprise, or would it be something that happened with either Biden's health or some other personal issue? I'm trying to think what could be a big enough October surprise.
I think a health scare by either one of the two candidates would in fact be that. The vaccine release, well, Trump has already, you know, said we're going to have it, and if we have it 2 weeks before the election, you know, we know if we have it 2 weeks for the election, there won't have been enough time to really do the field testing. You know, I mean, it is impressive. I mean, give the Trump administration and the FTC some credit for how they have sped up the whole vaccine development process, and in fact are doing a couple of steps at the time. But I think a vaccine release a couple weeks before the election, there will be such skepticism. You know, the time if the vaccine release happened last week or 2 weeks ago, and you really had time to validate that, look, here's another October surprise, and that is, does the pandemic get worse? You know, we're going to, you know, the schools are going to be open. Are we going to see major outbreaks and serious cases of the pandemic? That won't be a one-shot event. That'll be one of those building events that will say, no, we're not going in the right direction. As a side issue, you know, if most of the universities shut down and Joe Biden is depending upon college votes, you know, how are you going to get those kids to vote? Have they all gone back home? Where are they registered to vote? How do you mobilize them if they're all now scattered in various communities throughout the? That's a problem for the Democrats. That's not an October surprise, obviously. I think a health issue, a heart attack, a fall, a major illness, that's something. And there can also be, although I don't think there will be, there can also be the major flub, the major misuse of, you know, one thing I haven't mentioned very much is the Russian involvement. Yeah. The U.S. Senate just recently confirmed, you know, the U.S. Senate bipartisan report from the Intelligence Committee, you know, reaffirms, you know, what we knew already. And what will the Russians continue to do? You know, I don't think, you know, last time around, you know, there was people linking Hillary to a pizza parlor and pedophilia. I don't know if you remember that one, but that one didn't have a lot of traction. But if you wanted to believe it, you could. So there'll be so much crap out there. And, you know, it may be the case that what we'll really see is not the very visible things, but all those social media things that people get bombarded with, designed to either depress the likelihood of their voting or to try to persuade them to change their mind. You know, if Kellyanne Conway, who's leaving in a week, were to come out and say, Donald Trump's the worst president we've ever had, you know, CNN would eat that up and they'd make a big play of it. But most Americans don't know who Kellyanne Conway is. And she wouldn't be saying anything that the anti-Trump people don't already believe. So what this election is about is really getting those independent and that small number of moderate Republicans, independents to vote at a higher percentage for the Democrats than they did last time, and for more of those moderate Republicans to vote Democratic. You know, one little factoid, which is not very relevant, but Hillary Clinton actually did better. She lost it. She did better in Delaware County than Barack Obama did. Now, she didn't win it by any means, but you're seeing areas like Southern Delaware County, Westerville, Upper Arlington, Worthington, Bexley, Grandview, you know, all these areas that used to be comfortably Republican suburbs, they're changing. And many of the residents there, including some of the Republicans, would say, I haven't left the Republican Party. The Republican Party left me. But in other parts of the state, including southeastern Ohio, which used to be conservative Democratic territory, is now becoming more and more Republican. Western Ohio is more, the rural areas are more and more Republican. And then the question is, does Joe Biden have a chance to regain some of the lost votes in the Mahoning Valley, Youngstown area, because he's not an elitist Democrat like Barack and Hillary. And although actually Obama did okay in those areas, but so again, let's, you know, if you have any thoughts about October surprises that would move you, let me know, and then, or send them to the campaign of your choice, you know.
Herb, we got time for two more questions. We've got Don DePiro and then Jordan Hunt.
Okay.
Hello, Herb. So good to see you. You know, it wasn't long ago, at least it doesn't seem that long ago, when we could count on Walter Cronkite being a little bit right of center and Huntley and Brinkley being maybe a little less conservative, you know, and it's just gone so far the other way. And I have a tendency now to go on YouTube and watch the same story on Fox, ABC, NBC, and CBS. I watch the same story in 2 or 3 minute snippets to see how everybody's covering it. Where do you go to try to get some semblance of objectivity, true objectivity in news coverage these days?
Well, I don't think you can get true objectivity, but we have to define what you mean by objectivity, because I know when I talk to groups, if I say something oftentimes that they don't like, they don't agree with, they think of that as being biased or not objective. And I say, wait a second, if a candidate, Democrat or Republican, screwed up on something, and I don't say that, then in fact, I'm being biased in favor of nothingness, if you will. So, but you've raised the issue, and it's getting worse. It's absolutely getting worse. I think CNN has gotten worse, and MSNBC, they're actually in some ways they're not as bad as, on certain issues, they're not as bad as CNN. And Fox is just, and so your strategy is the good one. You know, go to multiple sites and look at what they say. The challenge for us as a country is that so many of us, and you know, people will say, well, the Trump people especially, they rely only on Fox News and their views of the world are distorted. Well, I mean, we have evidence to say if you rely only on Fox News, you're more likely to have certain beliefs. But how do you actually get people to do what you're doing? Because there isn't going to be one source. I mean, I shouldn't take, you can find people in groups now that are, you know, they have websites and saying, here's the news with cleansed a little from the obvious biases. How many Americans are going to take advantage of that? How many Americans are actually aggressive information seekers? One of the things that I try to do when I talk to groups, I said, do me a favor, subscribe to newspapers, because newspapers actually still provide a lot of the content or whatever. And I said, you know, and it's not cheap, but I said, look, subscribe to your local newspaper or papers. And also, here's 4 national papers. Subscribe to at least one of them: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and LA Times. And I'd even take LA Times off that list. And we know that the editorial policy of the Wall Street Journal is more conservative, but we also know they do a lot of good reporting. So I said, so actually, if you really want to help the health of the democracy, subscribe to newspapers. I'm making this too long, but the recent householder scandal, all of the information, the pieces were out there, you know, that there was heavy-handed lobbying on House Bill 6, that there was dark money going into these campaigns, that there were efforts made to undermine the repeal effort. All of those pieces were out there from newspaper reporters over the last number of months. It took the FBI to put all those pieces together into that narrative. But you're not going to see that kind of reporting very often from the electronic media. So again, you've raised the problem that worries so many people, because, you know, I have people who tell me, I absolutely know this to be the case. How do you know it? Because I read it. And they read it on a website that wasn't a newspaper. It was a trash website. Just awful. Well, I think are we out of time? If we're out of time, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity. These are great questions, and really quite fun. Is there one last question?
We had one question from Jordan Hunt.
I'm sorry.
Is Jordan still on?
Jordan wrote his question in the comments box.
Oh.
Do you have that? I don't have that here.
Okay, hold on. I'll read it for you here. It says, after a long career in academia, how do you feel about academia spending and the fact that revenue from government often exceeds tuition revenue? Does this incentivize the right things for academia institutions?
That's a very good question. And I'll look at it from the point of view, because the government spending that goes into academia is so massive when you count the medical area. But I think what the question really is referring to is all the student financial aid that goes into academia, you know, the Pell Grants and Stafford and all of that. And I think the question may be motivated by a concern that if in fact there is this much financial aid coming from the federal government, what are the incentives for universities to hold down costs? I don't know if that was the motivation for and all I'll say here is that there was a period of time where Ohio State, over the last, last number of years, but when Gordon Gee was president, the increases in tuition were among the lowest in the country. But I think what the caller is saying is, the questioner is saying that if federal money is available to help fill that gap, won't that be an incentive? And I think right now with this pandemic, universities are going to have to really squeeze, leave aside the athletic department, which is presumably separately funded, but they're going to have a devil of a time making up deficits of 50 million or more. And will the university bail them out? I think people would be really upset to do that. If the federal government ever were to change the reimbursement rates and lower them for Medicare and Medicaid, or start cutting budgets of the NIH, then all of a sudden the medical center, rather than being this wonderful revenue generator, could also be a tremendous drag. And what you have to remember is there is a core of the university that really is the arts and sciences and the professional schools and all of that. And how do you fund that? And if tuition is limited or federal resources are being withdrawn, or the state has to disinvest, a lot of people now say, well, the state's not a very important source of revenue. Well, as a percentage of the university's total budget, the state, you're playing games here with numbers, but as the university's budget goes up and up and you count the medical spending and all that, the state share of the student share of instruction, the state's percentage goes down, but still the state gives you about 300 to 400 million a year. That's pretty important. It's a drop in the bucket, but it's pretty important. If you didn't have that, you'd really be hurting. So I avoided the question in part, but I think the questioner was really raising an issue here about what kinds of bad incentives can there be when the federal government is promising about student loans or, or making it easier to, pay back student loans. I will say, again, I don't work for Ohio State anymore. So, but when people were saying, "Oh my goodness, the average student with debt at Ohio State, undergraduate, who is graduating with debt, leaves with $25,000 in debt, and isn't that horrible?" And I would say, well, gee, they got a 4 or 5 year degree. I mean, and they in fact had $25,000 in debt. That doesn't seem as horrible as somebody who has $150,000 in debt from an undergraduate institution and all of that. So I don't think we've talked politically and policy-wise as helpfully, and both parties here, but especially on the Democratic side, about what debt really means in this context and where the real problem areas are. But anyway, I'll stop filibustering.
Thanks, Dr. Asher. We really appreciate you being with us today and sharing your thoughts on the upcoming election. And I think the overriding message is everybody get out and vote.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, no, and vote early just in case. Yeah. And yes, it means vote absentee, because Ohio has given us that opportunity under a well-managed system. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This was fun.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, and hope you have a great rest of your week. We are adjourned.